In Gone Home, we take control of Katie, a young woman who returns from a long international trip earlier than expected, only to find her house completely desolate in the middle of the night. After noticing a strange note left on the front door by her younger sister Sam, as well as an unnerving, ominous message in the answering machine, the player's job becomes to explore the house and look for clues in order to untangle the mystery of what happened, even as you unravel the physical space of the house itself. As simple as its premise is, Gone Home is a game full of memorable moments. The story mostly unfolds through environmental storytelling, text logs, and bits of audio narration told from the perspective of Sam, Katie's younger sister. These bits of narration are very well written and delivered, so finding them often left me either teary-eyed or smiling with joy. In addition to this, you also have the exploratory side of things. Scouring the house and finding little pieces of information as you try to put together the game's underlying narrative is always exciting and engaging. And, of course, you have the physical space of the house itself, a space that is almost surreal and threatening, but also alluring. Finding secret passageways and hidden areas as you delve deeper into the house makes for a mesmerizing experience. And yet, the most striking moment in the whole game, for me, was much simpler. Near the end of the game, I opened my map to try to reorient myself as I had done several times before, only this time I suddenly stopped. The simple 2D outline of the house's architecture froze me in my tracks, and it was at this moment that I started to get the impression that the overarching idea or theme that frames the narrative of Gone Home is that of a rigid, oppressive sense of duality, a duality that is built upon the very foundations of this house and the people who live in it. Gone Home doesn't tell its story in a completely new and revolutionary way. In fact, the game follows the conventions of the so-called walking simulator genre pretty closely. However, Gone Home stands out to me because of the smart way in which it uses physical space, in this case the house itself, to tell its story in a surprisingly complex way. As you explore the house and find little bits of story that allow you to slowly peel off the layers of the overall narrative, the physical space of the house itself begins to open up as well. You find hidden compartments and secret pathways within the walls that snake their way in between rooms and allow access to sections of the house you couldn't get to before, not to mention new areas that you didn't even know were there in the first place. This adds a very particular sense of strangeness to the space. I mean, if you were returning home from a long vacation, you probably wouldn't have to spend a couple of hours trying to figure out how to get access to the eastern wing of your family's house. The player's progress through the house is not straightforward, but rather it requires them to delve into the bowels of this place and find a way through, sometimes in an unexpected manner. This use of space serves to give the player the impression that there are deeper layers to this house than the ones they can see on the surface, but it also gives the house a sense of hostility to it. It is almost as though the house itself is trying to prevent you from accessing its secrets, and of course, the ultimate goal of this is to create a parallel between the physical space of the house and the lives of the family that inhabits it. The house as a physical space and the house as a home. One of the first things that you encounter upon entering the house is a family portrait that depicts a happy and conventional nuclear family to such a bland degree it feels like a lifeless cliché. The more you explore the house, however, the more you learn that there are also more layers to this family than what you can see on first glance. Both parents in this family are actually miserable. The father's career as a writer is falling apart, which forces him to have to take freelancing gigs where he writes product reviews for a magazine, a job that he seems to despise and leads to him becoming emotionally distant. The mother, miserable in her own way, develops a relationship with a man from her work that causes her to question the current state of her life. Thus, as you delve deeper into the house, you learn that this seemingly perfect marriage is anything but, and that this seemingly perfect family is actually falling apart from within. However, the true heart of the game's story lies with Sam, the youngest daughter. Through our exploration of the house, both us as the player and Katie as the playable protagonist learn Sam's coming-of-age story. From her struggles having to move to a new school where she has trouble fitting in, to her journey as she questions her gender identity and eventually realizes that she's gay, to the stress of having to hide who she is from her parents and the fights that develop when they inevitably find out the truth and refuse to accept her queer identity, and finally, to falling in love with a classmate named Lonnie, only to learn that they'll soon have to go their separate ways because Lonnie will be joining the military after high school. Sam's story is complex and moving on its own right, but once again, the use of the house's space serves to enhance the overall narrative surrounding her. But before I dive fully into this topic, I want to talk briefly about something else first. Now, in addition to having a brilliant sense of space, Gone Home also excels at creating tone. From the very beginning, the house has a very liminal quality to it, which I think is the reason why so many people seem to go online to Google the question, is Gone Home a horror game? If you watched footage of the game without knowing anything about it, you'd probably think this is one of those backrooms horror type of games, and I totally get it. There is an air of surrealism to the house in this game, or perhaps a better way to put it would be to say that the game's tone constantly threatens you with the prospect of surrealism. As you explore the house, you'll suddenly hear a noise sometimes, almost like the sound of someone's shoes scraping the floor, or perhaps that of someone dragging furniture around. Or you'll turn back and you'll see a dimly lit hallway beyond the threshold of a doorway, and you'll get a deeply unsettling feeling. You begin to wonder if this could in fact be a horror game, and you begin to fear the moment when the game will finally bear its true face and you'll cross the threshold fully into the surreal reality of horror. And yet, despite the many notes that you'll find scattered around that seem to point to the possibility of a ghost roaming the halls of the house, the game never fully crosses into horror, which is not to say that this tone of surrealism and liminality is just a gimmick without a deeper narrative purpose. Ultimately, the reason why this house is crafted to have a deeply unnerving sense of liminality is because the story of the game in general is defined by the way in which it's caught in a moment in between moments. We are, in more ways than one, traversing through a transitional space. For one, Katie arrives to the house after Sam has already left but before her parents return, giving the house a very abstract vibe to it, as we find the remains of people's daily lives, images that tell us that there should be people here, that a family should live here, but there's no one home. We see only the empty space of the house with its little details, an empty pizza box, a book on a table, a message in the answering machine, almost as though this is not a house, but a parody of one. Then we have the fact that, at its core, this is a coming-of-age story, a narrative that explores the transitional period between childhood and adulthood. And, of course, we also have Sam's journey to discover and embrace herself as a queer person, which is a state of transition all its own. The surreal and liminal tone of the game makes us consider the question of what is a house? What is a home? The physical space we inhabit, the people we share that space with, or a combination of both? Well, for Sam, this house was never a home, and as we delve deeper into the story of the game, we experience the way in which the surreal and empty image of this house exposes the artificiality that lies at the core of this family, the deep-seated, deeply oppressive conflicts that it harbors, which takes me, finally, to the concept of duality. I'd argue that duality is one of the most important concepts that define the narrative of Gone Home, which seems appropriate since the game attempts to tackle themes such as queerness and gender identity. For one, you have the contrast between Sam and Katie. In more ways than one, Katie is the perfect daughter that Sam is not, perfect in a traditional sense. As you explore the house, for example, you'll eventually find a biology assignment belonging to Sam. The assignment requires that you place the stages of the menstrual cycle, which have been broken up into individual sentences, in the correct order so that the sentences make up a logical narrative. Sam, however, decides to use those sentences to create an absurdist war story where the images of menstruation are intertwined to that of bombs dropping from the sky and mutilated bodies. A story that ultimately gets Sam in trouble, as we can see from the note left by the teacher asking Sam to come to their office. This is a very funny and memorable moment on its own, but the reason it stands out to me so much is because as you continue to explore even deeper into the house, you'll find that Katie had to do that same school assignment at some point too. Unlike Sam, however, we can see that Katie answered exactly what was asked of her and got a perfect grade. This contrast outlines one of the game's most important dualities, that between Sam and Katie. Where Katie is someone who has no trouble conforming, Sam is the rebel one, the feminist, the one making pamphlets against the patriarchy and pissing people off. Where Katie is presumably cisgender and straight, Sam is queer. Where Katie is the perfect daughter, Sam is the one who constantly gets into trouble. Where Katie gives perfect answers, Sam takes the language of the narratives around her and messes with them, twisting them into her own story. Thus, there is a deeper duality that the contrast between the two daughters comes to symbolize, that of the gender binary. In addition to this, we have the dualities that exist within the other characters of the story. The more we learn about this family, for example, the more we realize that Katie's mother and father are not a unit, but rather seem to be in opposition to one another. There is also a sense of duality inherent to the character of Lonnie as well, one that Sam herself comments on, as she is confounded about the fact that Lonnie can be such a punk rock anti-authoritarian person while also wanting to pursue a career in the military at the same time. And then you have the house itself. When you first start the game, the whole west side of the house is inaccessible, leaving you to explore the rooms in the eastern section first. However, once you finally manage to gain access to the western side and you finish exploring the house in its entirety, you can open the map and see just how striking the layout of the house actually is. The eastern section of the house is comprised of hallways and rooms with regular shapes, nice squares and rectangles that fall into place neatly next to each other in exactly the way you'd expect the layout of a house to be. The western side of the house, however, is a chaos of irregular proportions, rooms with odd shapes clashing against each other and a diagonal hallway cutting through the middle of it almost violently. Looking at the map, you get the feeling that there are two completely different houses being smashed into one another here, each vying against the other rather than harmonizing into a coherent whole. In other words, the duality that defines this house and the people who inhabit it is etched into the very physical space, the layout of the rooms, the foundations of this house, and that is as fascinating as it is horrifying. And yet, ultimately, the reason I find the theme of duality as present in Gone Home so interesting is because at the center of this story, we have a character who is queer, someone who, in many different ways, actively rejects the binaries placed upon her identity. Some of the most fascinating and memorable moments of this game take place when you find the secret passageways that connect the different areas of the house, hidden paths and spaces used by Sam and Lonnie to move around and escape the gaze of the adults. Finding these passageways is amazing not only because they showcase a great sense of level design, but because they come to symbolize Sam's queerness. Even as she is oppressed by the duality that has been built into the very architecture of her house, Sam still carves her own hidden paths all throughout the spaces of it. And in the end, the game is willing to imagine a queer future in which this young woman realizes that the duality that has been built into this house, that has in fact been built into the very foundations of the space she inhabits, is harmful to her, and she decides to leave. However, before we can arrive at this happy ending, we have one last duality to contend with, the duality of time, or more specifically, the duality between the past and the present. As we play through the game, we learn about another long-dead story related to this house, the story of the house's previous owner, Oscar, a story that ended in tragedy and gave the house its nickname of the Psycho House. Sam and Lonnie seem to love the idea of a haunted house, and so they spend entire nights searching for Oscar and trying to communicate with him. It's an intimate experience that brings them closer together. However, when we, as Katie, explore the house, there is a sense that past and present are intertwined in a way that creates an unbreakable loop that we can't escape, an ominous sense of foreshadowing that looms just underneath the surface. What I mean is that as we play through the game, we don't know what actually happened to Sam, and some of the details that we find scattered around the house seem to hint at the possibility that the tragedy of the past might have repeated itself once again. I'll put it bluntly for the sake of clarity. As we unravel the secrets of the house, there is an uncertainty as to whether or not Sam might have taken her own life. There are a few clues that seem to point towards this end. Early on, we find that unnerving message in the answering machine, the one where we hear a pained voice calling Sam's name anxiously. Then we find a note with the words scratched out violently and which contains an ominous mention of the attic. Later still, we find a message passed between Sam and Lonnie in which they agree to do the thing later that night. Add to this the surreal, almost horror-like atmosphere of the game, and you begin to feel an anxiety growing in the back of your mind as you near the end of the story, and you realize that there is yet another duality, the duality between the possibility of a future and the absence of one. See, one of the most fascinating things about Gone Home is that when we, the player, enter the story, the main events of the game have already taken place. Whatever happened to Sam already happened. Much as is the case with the story of Oscar, we are learning about Sam's story in the past tense. Sam's story, like Oscar's story, is trapped in an inescapable past, a fact that only adds to that oppressive sense of ominous foreshadowing, that feeling that we may be approaching a tragic end and there is nothing that we can do about it. There is nothing that Sam can do because she may already be gone. Now, the writing in Gone Home is nuanced and sympathetic towards his development of Sam as a character, and so, as I played, I just kept thinking, there's no way, right? There's no way that this game is going to end up falling for the oldest trope in the book, the trope of burying your gaze. But having never played anything by this studio before, I just couldn't be sure. The possibility is certainly always there, looming in the background, and it becomes more and more plausible the more we learn about Sam's struggles, the more we learn about the bullying that Sam suffered in school, or the fight that took place when her parents learned that she's gay, or the subtle note that lets us know that Sam's parents consulted information regarding a conversion camp, or as we learn of the last night that Sam and Lonnie spent together, a night that ultimately left Sam feeling utterly heartbroken and alone. The clues are there and they keep stacking up in the back of the player's mind. But then we reach the end and we learn the twist of the story. That Sam and Lonnie never planned to take their own lives, but rather they have decided to run away together, leaving behind their homophobic families and the military and this house and everything it symbolizes. And all at once, that tone of isolation and emptiness, that feeling of being trapped in an inescapable past becomes instead a future made already present, as we realize that Sam is already, even at that moment, somewhere out there with Lonnie, searching for and living a queer future. And so, in the end, we are left with one final duality, the duality of the game's title. When we first begin the game, Gone Home seems to refer to Katie returning to her house and her family after a long trip. And yet, by the end, the title has been recontextualized as we realize that the words Gone Home actually refer not to Katie arriving at this house, but to Sam choosing to leave it behind so that she and Lonnie can find a place of their own that they can really call home.